After my accident, my in-laws asked when I planned to let go so my husband could move on. I woke in the ICU to find my mother-in-law, Patricia, standing at the foot of my bed with the estate lawyer. Not my husband, Ethan. Not flowers or relief that I'd survived a car accident that should have killed me. Just Patricia and a man in an expensive suit holding a briefcase. My body was broken in 12 places, machines breathing for me, and they were discussing my life insurance policy like I was already dead. Patricia noticed my eyes open and her face went pale, then flushed red. She grabbed the lawyer's arm and tried to pull him toward the door, but he'd already seen me awake. He stammered an apology and left quickly. Patricia stayed, smoothing her skirt and composing herself. She walked closer and said Ethan couldn't be here right now because of work commitments, but everyone was so worried about me. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. I couldn't speak because of the breathing tube. Couldn't ask why a lawyer was here instead of my husband. Patricia patted my hand once and said we'd talk when I was feeling better, then left before any nurses came back. Through the medication fog, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The breathing tube came out the next day, and I asked every nurse and doctor where my husband was. They said family had been notified of my improvement and visiting hours were posted, but Ethan didn't come. Patricia returned instead, this time with Ethan's father, Ronald. They sat in the visitor chairs like they were attending a business meeting, posture straight, faces serious. Ronald did most of the talking while Patricia watched me with calculating eyes. He said Ethan was devastated by my accident but was dealing with a lot right now, that my injuries were severe and the doctors weren't sure about my prognosis, that they wanted to discuss practical matters while I was lucid. I asked what practical matters, and Ronald pulled out papers from his briefcase. Advanced directives. Do not resuscitate orders. Papers about removing life support if I became vegetative. I was awake and talking, and they were discussing pulling my plug like I wasn't even in the room. I told them I didn't want to discuss that. And where the hell was Ethan? Patricia's mask slipped, and she said maybe Ethan needed space to process everything. That seeing me like this was too traumatic for him. I'd been in a coma for 3 days and awake for 1, and apparently my husband couldn't handle visiting his wife in the hospital. Ronald said they were just trying to plan ahead and be realistic about outcomes. The doctors had mentioned possible long-term disabilities, mobility issues, and chronic pain. They wanted to make sure everyone understood the quality of life I might face. I was 31 years old, and my in-laws were measuring whether my life was worth living while I was conscious and listening. I told them to get out. Patricia tried to say something soothing, but I screamed it, "Get out," and nurses came running. Security escorted Ronald and Patricia from my room while they protested they were just trying to help their daughter-in-law through a difficult time. My phone was in a plastic bag with my personal belongings, screen shattered but still working. I called Ethan and it went straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I texted him asking where he was and why he hadn't visited. The message showed as read, but no response came. I called his work and his assistant said he'd taken personal leave and wasn't available. I tried our home number and it rang until the machine picked up. My own voice on the recording saying Ethan and I weren't available. I left a message begging him to come to the hospital or at least call me. Nothing. My best friend Sloane came that evening after I texted her, and she was the first person who seemed actually happy I was alive. She cried when she saw me and held my hand carefully, avoiding all the IVs. I asked if she'd talked to Ethan and her face changed. She said she'd seen him at the grocery store yesterday and he'd seemed fine, not devastated or traumatized, just fine, buying wine and steaks like it was a normal week. Sloane told me something I wish I didn't know. 2 weeks before my accident, she'd seen Ethan having lunch with a woman at a restaurant downtown. They'd been holding hands across the table and he'd kissed her before they left. Sloane had convinced herself it was a work colleague or a misunderstanding, and hadn't told me because she didn't want to cause problems if she was wrong. But after seeing him at the store, after hearing he wouldn't visit his wife in the ICU, she thought I needed to know the truth. My husband was having an affair. And then I'd nearly died and now he couldn't even face me. Sloane said the woman was younger, maybe mid-20s, blonde hair and expensive clothes. She'd looked familiar, but Sloane couldn't place her. I lay in that hospital bed processing betrayal on top of trauma, and realized why Patricia and Ronald had been so eager to discuss end-of-life planning. If I died or became permanently disabled, Ethan could move on with his girlfriend without the mess of divorce. The nurses noticed I wasn't eating, and a social worker came to talk about depression after traumatic injury. I told her my husband was cheating on me, and his parents were trying to convince me to sign DNR orders while I was conscious and alert. She said that sounded complicated and gave me resources for marriage counseling. I asked her to note in my chart that under no circumstances were Patricia or Ronald allowed to make medical decisions for me. She said she'd talked to the attending physician about updating my medical proxy. That night, I couldn't sleep despite the pain medications. I kept thinking about Ethan kissing another woman while I drove home from work in the rain. Kept thinking about the semi-truck jackknifing and the sound of metal crunching and then nothing. Kept thinking about Patricia watching my monitors like she was waiting for them to flatline. My pelvis was shattered and would require multiple surgeries. My leg was held together with pins and rods. The traumatic brain injury meant possible cognitive issues that wouldn't be clear for months. I was a 31-year-old woman whose husband couldn't be bothered to visit after she nearly died. Physical therapy started within days. even though every movement felt like being broken all over again. The therapist said early mobilization was crucial for recovery. I had to learn to sit up without passing out from pain, had to learn to transfer from bed to wheelchair without screaming, had to relearn balance because the brain injury had affected my vestibular system. Every small task was monumental. Getting to the bathroom became an achievement worth celebrating. Patricia came back during one of these sessions and watched me struggle to move from bed to chair with 2 therapists supporting me. She had her phone out and was recording. I asked what she was doing, and she said she wanted to document my progress for Ethan since he couldn't be here. I told her to delete it, and she said she was just trying to help. The physical therapist asked her to leave so we could focus on the session. Patricia left, but I'd seen her face while recording. She'd looked satisfied watching me struggle, like she was collecting evidence. Sloan visited every day and slowly helped me piece together what was happening outside the hospital. She'd driven past our house and seen a blonde woman going inside with Ethan. She'd checked social media and found a girl named Amber Sutherland, who'd recently started following Ethan and liking all his posts. Amber worked at his company in marketing, 10 years younger than me, no wedding ring in her photos. Sloan showed me Amber's Instagram and my stomach dropped. She was beautiful in that effortless way some women are, all long legs and perfect skin. Her recent photos showed expensive restaurants and weekend trips. One photo from 2 weeks ago was at a winery I recognized because Ethan and I had talked about going there for our anniversary. He'd taken her instead. I zoomed in on the photo and saw his hand in the corner of the frame, holding a wine glass. The caption said, "Best weekends with the best person," with a heart emoji. My husband was flaunting his girlfriend on social media while I was in the ICU. The doctor came in to discuss my treatment plan and long-term prognosis. Multiple surgeries needed for the pelvis and leg, months of physical therapy, possible permanent mobility limitations, chronic pain was likely, and the brain injury might cause lasting cognitive effects like memory problems or difficulty concentrating. She said some patients made full recoveries and others had to adjust to a new normal. I asked her about the visit from the lawyer with my mother-in-law, and her face went carefully neutral. She said several family members had inquired about my advance directives and whether I had paperwork on file. I told her I didn't have any DNR orders and didn't want any, that I was planning to recover fully, and I wanted it noted that my in-laws had no authority over my medical care. The doctor said she'd make sure the chart was updated. She also mentioned that my insurance was through Ethan's company plan and there'd been some questions about coverage limits from the billing department. I asked what kind of questions, and she said I should probably speak with the hospital financial counselor. The financial counselor was a tired-looking woman named Denise, who brought a folder thick with papers. My hospital stay so far had cost over $300,000. The surgeries I needed would cost at least another $200,000. Insurance would cover most of it, but I'd be looking at significant out-of-pocket costs, possibly $50,000 or more depending on how long recovery took. Denise said my insurance plan had a lifetime maximum benefit, and with injuries this severe, I could hit that cap. She asked about my employment, and I told her I'd been a graphic designer at a small firm. Denise asked if I had disability insurance, and I said yes, through work. She made notes and said she'd help me apply once we had a better timeline for recovery. Then she mentioned something that made my blood cold. She'd received a call from someone asking about what happened if a spouse removed an injured person from their insurance plan. Denise had explained that would be illegal during active treatment and would leave the hospital with unpaid bills that could go to collections. The caller had thanked her and hung up. I asked if the caller had given a name, and Denise said no, but it had been a woman's voice. Patricia was trying to figure out if they could pull my insurance coverage while I was in the hospital. I called Ethan again, and this time he answered. His voice was flat when he said hello, like he was talking to a telemarketer. I asked where he'd been and why he hadn't visited, and he said he'd been dealing with a lot. I asked him about Amber Sutherland, and the line went silent. Then he said we needed to talk about some things, but now wasn't the time. I said I was in the ICU and when exactly would be the time. He said I was being dramatic and making everything about me as usual. I was being dramatic. I'd nearly died in a car accident and was calling from a hospital bed, and he thought I was being dramatic for asking about his girlfriend. I told him I knew about the affair and the lunches and the winery. He said it wasn't like that Amber was just a friend who understood him in ways I never had, that our marriage had problems long before the accident. I asked what problems, and he said I was always working, always tired, never wanted to do anything fun anymore. I'd been working 60-hour weeks to help pay off his student loans, but apparently that made me a bad wife. Ethan said maybe the accident was a sign we needed to reevaluate our relationship, that he'd been unhappy for a while and didn't know how to tell me. I asked if he'd been so unhappy that he couldn't even visit me in the hospital, and he said seeing me like this was too hard, that he needed space to process his feelings. I started crying, and he said I was being manipulative, using tears to make him feel guilty. I asked if he loved Amber, and he said he didn't know, maybe, that she made him feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Then he said something that made everything clear. He asked how long my recovery would take, not because he cared about me, but because he wanted a timeline. I asked him what he meant, and he said his mother had mentioned I might have permanent disabilities, and he needed to know what he was dealing with. I realized he was calculating whether to stay in a marriage with a disabled wife or divorce me and move on with Amber. I told him to go to hell and hung up. Then I called a divorce lawyer from my hospital bed. The lawyer was a woman named Victoria Reeves who specialized in high-conflict divorces. She came to the hospital that evening after I called her office explaining my situation. Victoria was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and direct. She listened to everything, taking notes on a legal pad. The affair, the missing husband, the in-laws with the estate lawyer, the questions about removing insurance, all of it. When I finished, Victoria said this was more common than I'd think. Spouses who couldn't handle a partner's serious injury or illness and wanted out but didn't want to look like the bad guy. She said the key was protecting myself financially and medically before Ethan made any moves. First thing was filing for divorce immediately to establish a timeline. Second was documenting every asset and bank account before he could hide money. Third was getting restraining orders if necessary to keep Patricia and Ronald away from my medical care. Victoria said she'd start paperwork immediately and file by end of week. She asked about my assets and I told her we owned a house jointly, had joint bank accounts, and retirement accounts through our jobs. Victoria said she'd freeze the accounts so nothing could be moved without court approval. Sloan went to our house the next day while Ethan was at work. I'd given her my key and the code to our safe. She found bank statements showing Ethan had opened a separate account I didn't know about with $60,000 in it. Money he'd transferred from our joint savings over the past 6 months in small increments I hadn't noticed because I'd been so busy with work. Sloan photographed everything and found receipts in his car for jewelry I'd never received, expensive dinners at places we'd never gone together, a hotel receipt from a weekend he'd told me he was at a work conference. She found a burner phone in his gym bag with texts to Amber about how much he loved her and couldn't wait to start their life together. The texts went back 8 months. 8 months he'd been planning a life with someone else while coming home to me every night. Sloan brought me everything and I cried so hard a nurse came in to check on me. The betrayal hurt worse than any of my physical injuries. The accident had just made his exit strategy easier. If I died or became disabled, he got out without looking like the villain. If I recovered, he'd have to actually divorce me. Victoria filed the divorce papers 3 days later and had Ethan served at work. His response was immediate. He called screaming about how I was being vindictive and trying to ruin his life. That I was serving him divorce papers while I was in the hospital was proof of how cruel I was. I reminded him he was having an affair and had abandoned me after a near-fatal accident. He said the affair was my fault for being a terrible wife. That Amber made him happy in ways I never could. That I was selfish for not understanding he had needs that weren't being met. I told him his needs could go to hell and hung up. An hour later, Patricia called demanding to know what I thought I was doing. I said I was divorcing her cheating son, and she said I was being unreasonable, that all marriages went through rough patches and I should be willing to work on things. I asked if she knew about Amber, and Patricia went quiet. Then she said Ethan deserved to be happy, and maybe I wasn't the right person for him anymore. My mother-in-law was defending her son's affair. Patricia said something that revealed everything. She said if I really loved Ethan, I'd let him go so he could move on with his life. That my injuries were severe and I'd be a burden for years if I even fully recovered. That it wasn't fair to trap Ethan in a marriage with someone who might never be the same. She actually used the word burden to describe me, her daughter-in-law who'd nearly died. I asked if she understood how sociopathic she sounded, and she said she was being practical. That Ethan was young and shouldn't have to sacrifice his future taking care of an invalid. That the kindest thing I could do was agree to a quick divorce with minimal financial demands so he could start over. I told her I was taking him for everything in the divorce, and she said that would be a mistake. That they had resources and lawyers, and I should think carefully about making enemies of them. It sounded like a threat. I told her if she contacted me again, I'd get a restraining order, and hung up. Then I told Victoria about the call, and she said to document everything, that Patricia had just made her case much easier. The first surgery was on my pelvis. 4 hours of doctors breaking and resetting bones held together with plates and screws. I woke up in more pain than I'd felt in my life. The nurses administered morphine through my IV, but it barely touched the agony. Physical therapy started the same day, just sitting up in bed, and I passed out twice from the pain. The therapist said this was normal and recovery would be slow. Sloan visited every day and brought me things from home, comfortable clothes and my laptop and photos of better times. She'd also secretly installed security cameras at our house because she didn't trust Ethan not to take or destroy things. The cameras caught him bringing Amber over 2 days after I filed for divorce. They had sex in our bed, the bed I'd picked out, on sheets I'd bought. Sloan showed me the footage and I threw up. Not because of the sex, but because of how happy he looked with her. Like he'd been pretending with me for years and finally got to be himself. Victoria said the footage was perfect for the divorce proceedings, proof of adultery, and timeline of the affair. Ethan's lawyer sent a counteroffer for the divorce. He wanted the house, both cars, and all retirement accounts. He offered me $20,000 and whatever personal items I could prove were mine. Victoria laughed when she read it and said we'd be rejecting that immediately. She filed a response demanding half of everything, including the $60,000 in his hidden account, spousal support during my recovery, and payment of all medical bills since he'd abandoned me while injured. Ethan's response was another screaming phone call about how I was trying to destroy him financially. I said he'd destroyed our marriage by having an affair for 8 months. He said the affair was my fault for being boring and never wanting to do anything, that Amber was fun and spontaneous and made him feel young. I told him Amber was 10 years younger and working in marketing, Of course, she seemed fun. She didn't have real responsibilities yet. He said I was jealous and bitter and he couldn't wait to be free of me. I said the feeling was mutual and reminded him he owed me half our assets plus support. He said he'd fight me on every dollar. Patricia filed something that made Victoria furious. A petition requesting guardianship over me based on my brain injury and claiming I wasn't competent to make medical or financial decisions. Patricia claimed I needed someone to manage my care and finances during recovery, and since Ethan was filing for divorce, she was the appropriate guardian as my mother-in-law. The petition included the video she'd taken of me struggling in physical therapy as evidence of my incapacity. Victoria said this was an obvious attempt to control my medical care and finances, so they could force me to accept a bad divorce settlement. We filed an opposition with statements from my doctors confirming I was mentally competent and making my own medical decisions. The judge denied Patricia's petition immediately and issued a restraining order prohibiting her from contacting me or my medical team. Patricia violated the restraining order the next day by calling the hospital pretending to be my sister to get information about my treatment. The hospital reported her to the police and she was charged with a misdemeanor. Victoria said this behavior was giving us ammunition for the divorce case. The second surgery was on my leg, replacing the temporary external fixation with permanent rods and screws. Another 4 hours under anesthesia and days of recovery. The doctors said I'd walk again but might have a permanent limp and chronic pain. Physical therapy intensified with twice daily sessions teaching me to bear weight on my leg and use a walker. Every step felt like broken glass grinding in my bones. My therapist said pain was part of healing and I had to push through it. Sloan brought me a legal pad and I started writing everything down. Every doctor's appointment, every surgery, every therapy session, every expense. Victoria said documentation would be crucial for the divorce and for going after Ethan for medical expenses. I also started recording my recovery on my phone, videos of me struggling through physical therapy, crying from pain, slowly improving week by week. Not for social media, but for the divorce proceedings. Evidence that while Ethan was living with his girlfriend, I was fighting to relearn how to walk. Ethan filed a motion claiming he shouldn't have to pay spousal support because the accident wasn't his fault and my injuries weren't his responsibility. His lawyer argued that Ethan had offered to stay married and support my recovery, but I'd chosen to file for divorce. Therefore, I'd forfeited any claim to his financial support. Victoria said this was one of the most callous legal arguments she'd seen. She filed a response with evidence of the affair timeline, the hidden bank account, his abandonment while I was hospitalized, and his mother's attempts to gain guardianship. She argued that Ethan had constructively abandoned the marriage before the accident, and his behavior after constituted extreme emotional cruelty. The judge ordered Ethan to pay temporary support during the divorce proceedings, and half of my medical expenses not covered by insurance. Ethan's response was to post on social media about being victimized by a vindictive ex who was trying to ruin his life. Sloan screenshot everything and sent it to Victoria. Ethan was building our case for us by publicly complaining about having to support his injured wife. I was transferred to a rehabilitation facility after 3 weeks in the hospital. Insurance only covered 3 weeks there, so I'd need to go home after that. Except I couldn't go home because Ethan was living there with Amber. Victoria got a court order granting me exclusive use of the marital home during divorce proceedings. Ethan had 24 hours to move out. He showed up at the rehab facility the day before he had to leave, and I refused to see him. He left a note with the nurses saying he hoped I was happy ruining his life and relationship. The nurse who gave me the note looked disgusted and said my husband seemed like a real piece of work. I asked her to throw the note away. Ethan and Amber moved into an apartment across town, and he sent me a bill for the moving truck, claiming I owed him half since I'd forced him to leave. Victoria responded that he'd vacated due to his own choices and owed me nothing. The bill went away. Sloan did a walkthrough of my house before I came home and found evidence Ethan had stolen things. My grandmother's jewelry was gone. The expensive TV was gone. The artwork I'd bought before we got married was gone. Sloan documented everything, and Victoria added it to the growing list of claims against him. The transition home was brutal. The house had stairs I couldn't manage yet and doorways too narrow for my wheelchair. Sloan hired contractors to build a ramp and widen doors. My insurance covered some modifications through their catastrophic injury clause, but I paid out of pocket for the rest. The total was $18,000 to make my own house accessible. Victoria added it to the list of expenses Ethan would pay in the final settlement. I could barely take care of myself those first weeks. Couldn't cook because I couldn't stand long enough. Couldn't clean because I couldn't bend or reach. Couldn't shower without help because I might fall. Sloan moved in temporarily and became my caretaker, helping me with everything from dressing to bathing. I hated being so dependent. Hated that my husband had chosen this exact moment of my greatest need to abandon me. Every day was a fight against depression and despair. My therapist at rehab had warned me that emotional recovery would be harder than physical recovery, that survivors of serious accidents often struggled with PTSD and depression. She'd been right. I had nightmares about the crash and woke up crying. I had panic attacks when it rained. I couldn't drive past the intersection where it happened without hyperventilating. My employer had held my job for 6 weeks but called to say they needed to fill my position permanently. I could come back part-time once I was cleared by doctors, but they couldn't guarantee my old role or salary. I asked how I was supposed to survive on part-time work while recovering from catastrophic injuries, and the HR manager said she was sorry, but they had business needs. I filed for disability through my insurance and was denied twice before Victoria helped me appeal with medical documentation. The disability payments were a fraction of my salary, but better than nothing. Ethan found out about the disability payments and tried to claim them as marital assets, subject to division. Victoria shot that down immediately, but the fact he'd tried said everything about his character. He was trying to take money from his disabled wife's disability payments. Amber posted a photo on Instagram of an expensive purse with the caption, "When he spoils you," and the date stamp was the same day Ethan had claimed he couldn't afford his court-ordered support payment. Victoria subpoenaed Amber's social media for the divorce proceedings. The deposition was 6 months after my accident. I had to sit across from Ethan and his lawyer and answer questions about our marriage, my injuries, my medical expenses, everything. Ethan's lawyer tried to make me look like a gold digger who was exaggerating my injuries for financial gain. He asked why I needed so many surgeries, and couldn't I just accept some limitations? He asked if I'd considered that my constant medical appointments were inconvenient for everyone else. He implied I was prolonging recovery to maximize support payments. Victoria objected to almost every question, and eventually the judge on video conference told Ethan's lawyer to stop badgering the witness. Then it was Ethan's turn to be questioned. Victoria destroyed him methodically. She asked about the affair timeline, and he claimed it had only been 2 months. She showed him phone records proving 8 months. She asked about the hidden bank account, and he claimed it was for a surprise for me. She showed him receipts for jewelry given to Amber. She asked why he didn't visit me in the hospital, and he said it was too emotionally difficult. She showed him social media posts from that week of him at bars and parties. By the end, Ethan looked furious and his lawyer looked defeated. Patricia was deposed next, despite not being party to the divorce. Victoria had subpoenaed her as a witness regarding the estate lawyer visit and guardianship petition. Patricia tried to claim she'd only been looking out for my best interests by discussing end-of-life planning. Victoria asked if my best interests included discussing removing life support while I was conscious and improving. Patricia said she'd just been having a theoretical conversation with the lawyer. Victoria presented the lawyer's deposition, where he'd testified Patricia had specifically hired him to review my estate documents and life insurance policies. Patricia's face went red. Victoria asked about the guardianship petition, and Patricia claimed she'd filed it because she was worried about me making rash decisions while injured. Victoria asked if that included my decision to divorce her son after discovering his affair. Patricia had no good answer. Victoria asked about the phone call where Patricia had called me a burden and suggested I let Ethan go. Patricia claimed she'd never said that. Victoria played a recording. I'd started recording all calls with Ethan's family after the first few. Patricia's voice came through the speaker, clearly calling me a burden and suggesting I was trapping Ethan. Patricia left the deposition in tears. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for 8 months after my accident. I could walk with a cane by then, though I still had significant pain and limitations. I wore a professional dress to court and made sure I looked strong and capable. Ethan showed up with Amber, who sat in the gallery behind him wearing an engagement ring. They'd gotten engaged while still legally married to me. Victoria pointed this out to the judge, who did not look pleased. The hearing took all day with both sides presenting evidence and arguments. Victoria laid out the timeline of the affair, the abandonment, the hidden assets, the medical expenses, everything. She presented my medical records showing the extent of my injuries and ongoing treatment needs. She showed Ethan's social media posts complaining about supporting me. She played the recording of Patricia calling me a burden. Ethan's lawyer tried to argue Ethan shouldn't be punished financially for wanting out of an unhappy marriage. The judge asked if he'd been unhappy enough to have an 8-month affair and hide $60,000. Ethan's lawyer didn't have a good response. The judge ruled in my favor on almost everything. I got the house, both cars, 3/4 of our joint savings, and half of Ethan's retirement accounts. Ethan had to pay back the $60,000 from the hidden account, plus my legal fees. He had to pay spousal support for 5 years, or until I remarried, whichever came first. He had to cover all my medical expenses not paid by insurance, including future surgeries and physical therapy. The judge said Ethan's behavior during my medical crisis constituted abandonment and extreme emotional cruelty, justifying the disproportionate split. The judge also noted that Ethan's affair and hidden assets showed financial dishonesty that warranted consequences. Ethan's face went white as the judge read the ruling. Amber looked furious. Patricia stood up in the gallery and shouted that this was unfair and the judge was biased. The judge held her in contempt and fined her $1,000. Security escorted Patricia from the courtroom while she screamed about lawyers and appeals. Ethan had to physically hold Amber back from approaching me as I left with Victoria. Outside the courthouse, Victoria told me this was one of the most satisfying wins of her career. That watching a judge punish a man for abandoning his catastrophically injured wife gave her faith in the system. Ethan filed for bankruptcy 8 months after the divorce was finalized, claiming the settlement had financially ruined him. Victoria said he couldn't discharge the spousal support or medical expense obligations through bankruptcy. Those debts survived. Ethan would be paying for years regardless. He and Amber broke up 4 months after the divorce when she realized he was actually broke and would be for a long time. She posted a vague Instagram story about toxic men and growth and being free. Sloan sent me screenshots with commentary and we laughed about it. Patricia sent me a letter saying I'd destroyed her son's life and she hoped I was happy. I threw it away without reading the whole thing. I didn't need closure from people who'd treated me as disposable. My physical recovery continued slowly. I had 3 more surgeries over the next year to correct complications and improve mobility. I still walked with a slight limp and had chronic pain that flared in cold weather. Some days were harder than others. But I was alive and independent and rebuilding a life without people who'd wished I'd just die so they could move on. Sloan and I started a support group for women whose partners had abandoned them during serious illness or injury. We met monthly at a community center and heard stories that made mine seem almost tame. Women whose husbands had filed for divorce while they were in chemotherapy. Women whose partners had left when they were diagnosed with MS or Parkinson's. Women whose families had tried to institutionalize them to take their money. The group became a lifeline for all of us. Proof we weren't alone or crazy or too much. That the problem was never us. It was people who saw loved ones as burdens when they stopped being convenient. I got my therapist certified to run the groups, and we expanded to 3 locations. Helping other women became part of my own healing, transforming trauma into purpose. Victoria volunteered to provide legal consultations at the meetings and helped several women protect themselves from predatory soon-to-be exes. We called the group Phoenix Rising because we were all rebuilding from ashes. 2 years after the accident, I was walking without a cane most days and working full-time from home as a freelance designer. My client list had grown through word of mouth, and I was making more than I had at my old job. I'd converted my garage into a studio and filled it with plants and good light. The house was fully mine now, redecorated to erase every trace of Ethan and filled with things I actually loved. Sloan had moved back to her own place but came over for dinner every week. We'd gotten closer through everything, the kind of friendship that forms when someone sees you at your absolute worst and stays anyway. My support group was up to 60 active members across 5 locations. Some women came for months, others for years. Some came once, got what they needed, and moved on. All of them left stronger than they arrived. I'd also started speaking at medical conferences about patient advocacy and the importance of protecting vulnerable patients from family members with questionable motives. Hospitals were updating their policies on medical decision-making and proxy access based on recommendations I'd helped develop. I ran into Ethan at a coffee shop 3 years after the accident. He was alone, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. I almost didn't recognize him without the arrogant confidence he'd always carried. He saw me and froze, coffee cup halfway to his mouth. I nodded politely and turned back to my laptop. I was working on a logo design and didn't have time for him. He came over anyway and asked if we could talk. I said I didn't think we had anything to discuss. He said he'd wanted to apologize for a long time but didn't know how to reach me. I told him I'd blocked his number and email years ago. He said he understood and he deserved that. That he'd been a coward and a terrible husband and he was sorry. That watching me go through everything alone had haunted him. I asked if it had haunted him before or after Amber left him. His face flushed and he said he'd deserved that too. That the whole relationship with Amber had been a fantasy built on lies. That he'd destroyed something real for something that was never going to last. I said yes, he had. He asked if I'd ever forgive him, and I said probably not, but I didn't think about him much anymore, which was its own kind of freedom. I packed up my laptop and left him standing there. I'd wasted enough of my life on Ethan already. 5 years after the accident, Sloan and I were planning the Phoenix Rising annual fundraiser when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Patricia. I hadn't heard her voice in 4 years, and it still made my stomach clench. She said she'd gotten my number from my support group website and hoped I didn't mind her calling. I minded very much, but let her continue. She said she'd been in therapy for years working through what she'd done, that her therapist had helped her understand how she'd almost become an accomplice to what would have been essentially medical murder, that she'd let her love for her son override basic human decency and morality. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know she understood the gravity of what she'd done, that she'd treated me as disposable, and that was unforgivable. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said I appreciated her taking accountability, but I'd never have a relationship with her. That therapy was good, but it didn't undo the trauma of having your mother-in-law suggest you should die to make things easier. Patricia said she understood and she hoped I was doing well. I said I was, and hung up. Sloan asked who it was, and I told her. She said Patricia had a lot of nerve calling after everything. I agreed, but felt something shift anyway. Not forgiveness, but maybe the tiniest bit of closure. Sometimes people do grow and change, even if it's too late to fix what they broke. I got remarried 6 years after the accident to someone I met through the support group. Not a member, but a volunteer counselor who'd come to help and ended up staying. His name was David, and he'd become a widower 3 years before when his wife died of cancer. He understood grief and loss and rebuilding in ways most people didn't. Our relationship grew slowly from friendship to something more, built on honesty and respect and not needing each other to be anything other than ourselves. He didn't care about my limp or the scars from surgeries or the bad days when pain kept me in bed. He'd seen worse and knew that loving someone meant accepting all of them, not just the easy parts. We got married in my backyard with 50 people from Phoenix Rising watching and crying happy tears. Sloan was my maid of honor and gave a speech about watching me nearly die, and then watching me build something beautiful from the wreckage. David's daughters were our flower girls and welcomed me into their family without reservation. For the first time in years, I felt purely happy without any shadow of trauma hanging over it. I'd survived the accident, survived the betrayal, and built a life worth living despite everyone who'd hoped I wouldn't. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.